Welcome to Design Talks Now, where we share what matters most. Hosted by Design Pavilion to keep our conversations going and us connected during these challenging times. I'm Eileen Shaw, producer of Design Pavilion and Design Talks. As New Yorkers, we know how important and how taken for granted our public transportation system is in our daily lives. Today's talk explores the future of transportation in New York City, focusing on the decades to come. This topic is inspired by the latest publication from the Skidmore, Owings Merrill Thinkers series, which reflects on the interventions that are shaping new ways of living and moving, especially post-pandemic. New York City's transportation system is a network of complex infrastructure. The most populated city in the United States, its transportation system includes one of the largest subway systems in the world's first mechanically ventilated vehicle tunnel, an aerial tramway, an extensive bus system, Staten Island and citywide ferry systems, and yellow taxis and borough taxis. To date, private cars are less used here in comparison to other cities in the U.S. Our panelists are at the core of the city's direction and planning in all aspects of our daily commutes around town. Our moderator is Tom Wright, President and CEO of Regional Plan Association, a private nonprofit corporation. RPA serves to improve the prosperity, infrastructure, sustainability, health, and quality of New York tri-state metropolitan regions by preparing long-range plans and advocating for their implementation. Our panelists are Juliet Michelson, Project Manager at MTA Transformation. Juliet coordinates the consolidation and transformation of all capital planning and delivery functions at the MTA. With us also is writer and editor covering New York City, Amy Plitt. She's currently an editor at The Real Deal and previously was the editor of Curbed New York. She's also the author of Subway Adventures Guide, New York City, a guidebook about the ends of New York City subway lines. And we're joined by Luke Bridle, Associate Director at Skidmore, Owings Merrill, with experience in more than 60 mass transit and rail stations throughout the U.S., Canada, the United Kingdom, and Europe. Luke is an expert in the design evolution of mass transit and rail stations, including interpretation of ridership data, pedestrian analysis, space planning, and preparation of planning and technical reports. With backgrounds in architecture, advocacy, journalism, and policymaking, this panel offers expert perspectives on the changes required for post-pandemic. So now, let's begin.
Thanks, Eileen, and thanks Design Talks Now. We've got a great panel to talk today about the future of transportation. I'm really pleased to be joined here by Luke Bridle, who is a designer who's worked on infrastructure projects around the world, Juliet Michelson, who is with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York, dealing with the fallout of COVID, and Amy Plitt, who as an editor and writer has really talked about and thought about the larger implications of what's happening right now. I've got a few images just thinking from my perspective at Regional Plan Association. We've been kind of looking at what's happening to the tri-state metropolitan region over the last 7 months since COVID hit and trying to think about both chronicling what's going on and what it's going to mean for the future. The first image showing pre-COVID work trips into Manhattan just kind of illustrates how New York City is at the center of this vast metropolitan region and really a kind of invention for creating wealth and prosperity. But it depends on the diverse and talented and educated workforce that flows in and out every single day. And so there are over 200,000 people within Manhattan going to the Manhattan CBD. This is Manhattan south of 60th Street. Over 400,000 from Brooklyn, over 300,000 from Queens, but almost 300,000 from northern New Jersey, almost 400,000 from the Bronx and upper Manhattan. And so every day, really, this kind of engine that we had relied on the ability to move people in and out. Most of the trips into the CBD have relied on transit no matter where they're coming from. Over 1.6 million daily trips on transit from all parts of the region into the Manhattan CBD, just about 250,000 trips by automobile. And interestingly, probably not surprisingly, that number has been fairly flat for more than a generation. There is just a limited number of people who can come into a place like Manhattan by car because the geometry, the physics don't allow more than that. And then what we see is a smaller number of people who take other modes, really biking and walking, mostly from within Manhattan. And of course, we have been expanding that with our building of bike lanes and pedestrianizing New York City. But again, what the takeaway from this image is to see that we all really rely on mass transit to make this engine work. Changes in transportation mode post-COVID show how when we had to shut down the economy, all modes declined dramatically, but in particular, subway and bus ridership and commuter rail really close to flatlined, over a 95% reduction in those early weeks in commuters and people traveling on our transit system. We saw a significant reduction, but not as much in auto travel. And bike ridership, and this is kind of, we're using city bike trips to illustrate what's happening on bikes, it declined too, but it started to come up fairly quickly. And in fact, more recently, we've actually seen more people traveling by bike than pre-COVID. Likewise, people driving into the city and looking at the MTA's crossings, we can see that didn't decline by as much, and it's been recovering fairly quickly. And I understand on some of the congested highways of this region already, we're now seeing higher ridership and more demand than we were pre-COVID. Whereas this is a really worrisome trend for us. It seems like mass transit ridership has been only slowly recovering and in some ways kind of plateauing. So those are concerns for all of us, thinking about the system of the region and how we're going to come back and what the future of transportation is going to be. These were the preliminary recommendations from the Surface Transportation Advisory Council that the city convened earlier this summer. I was one of the members of that council. It was interesting, the experience of working with a diverse group of advocates and transportation experts, thinking about transit, pedestrians, bikes, the public realm, what to do about taxis, for hire vehicles, and goods movement and curb management. And there was an enormous amount of consensus among the group about what we ought to be doing at this time to really kind of address what's going on. We talked about giving priorities to bus lanes and encouraging safe transit usage, because one of the things, and I'm sure Juliet will talk about this, is that we are seeing other global regions and cities recover and people coming back to work and using mass transit without a spike in COVID, which is an encouraging sign. At the same time, we really talked about kind of building out and finishing the network of bike lanes and protected spaces in New York. We've been on this journey now for over a decade, but there still are too many isolated pieces of the network, and it needs to be really connected and serve all parts of the community. Dealing with taxis and for-hire vehicles was a high priority for the group, and figuring out how to restore public confidence and make sure we could do that safely. And then a lot of it was kind of dealing with traffic goods movement. We know e-commerce has exploded during this period, and a lot of us expect that to remain. So how are we going to be able to deliver goods without congesting the streets and causing traffic mayhem, and thinking about things like placard reform, which is to kind of curb the illegal use of placards by sometimes public sector folks, and thinking about HOV restrictions, congestion pricing, and other things to really manage the flow of vehicles coming into the city, into the core of the city. So those are just some of the ideas that we've kicked around, but I'm really excited to talk with all of you about this and get your thoughts and reactions to it. Juliet, if I could, maybe you starting from the public sector perspective and at the MTA, what have you seen as the impacts of COVID-19? How is the MTA thinking about it? What kinds of plans have changed due to what's going on?
Yeah, sometimes it really seems like everything has changed, right? So look, our initial priority was obviously just keeping the system going, keeping people safe, the essential workers who were depending on the subway throughout the real crisis in the spring and early summer. You know, you might remember nobody even really knew how COVID was transmitted back then. And so it was just really tricky to manage the system. It was even trickier and very sadly because so many of our employees were out on leave, either because they were sick or because they were in contact with people who were sick. And so we tried very, very hard to maintain normal levels of service, and for the most part succeeded. There were a couple weeks where that was difficult because we literally did not have enough conductors. But for the most part, we kept the service going. And, you mentioned that at our lowest point, the subway system was at about 7% ridership, which seems so little and is. But because the New York City system is so big, that is still hundreds of thousands of people on the subway. In fact, I believe that it is as many people as use the Washington, D.C. subway on a typical weekday. So, we still had a lot of people to carry around. Since Memorial Day, we've really focused on keeping the system very visibly clean and safe, and making our customers feel safe to return when they are ready to come back, when the economy is ready to pick up again. And interestingly, the comeback curves look very different by mode. So as you said, we manage bridges and tunnels also, not just transit. And bridges and tunnels is basically back to normal. We're at about 80-90% of normal traffic levels. Of all the transit modes, buses came back the soonest, which I suppose is not that surprising. First of all, you wait outside, you can open the windows. People just perceive buses to be safer, just sort of generally. And so by late August, bus ridership was at about 80% of normal ridership levels. Unfortunately, since September 1st, I suspect since traffic has picked up again, bus ridership levels have dropped. All summer, as many people were taking the subway as were taking buses, which typically more than twice as many people take subways. But in September, bus riderships dropped dramatically, and we're now back down to about 50% of normal ridership. And then subways have been increasing, but just really slowly. We're at about 30% right now, and, hoping that schools reopening will change that, but it's just been very slow. And lastly, the railroads, their dip was even deeper than the subways, and they have been the slowest to come back.
Mm-hmm.
I assume because those commuter riders, suburban riders, are typically sort of white collar wealthier than the average transit users. And in fact, anecdotally, I've been told that on Metro North, there are a lot more suburb to suburb trips. And that's sort of carrying a lot of whatever minimal ridership there is, and very, very few suburb to city. So we're keeping a very close eye on all that.
So it's really important to distinguish between the different modes and what kinds of travel. And it's pretty shocking to hear that bus ridership was up higher in August than in September. We kind of anticipated that it would be steady progression, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
Do you think that might be because bus fare collection came back at the beginning of September? Is that something that the agency thinks had something to do with it?
That may also be a factor for sure.
Yeah. So for the summer, it was essentially free to ride the buses. Now the MTA is charging again.
Yes.
Yeah. Luke, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. You've worked around the world and designed elements of some of these transit systems. What are your thoughts on this?
Things have certainly changed in the short term, as you both have explained, which certainly there's some alarming statistics that we've covered. But I don't think we fully know what the long-term answer to this question is. I think we need to sort of enter into a period of perhaps reflection and analysis for the foreseeable future. And part of this, I think, is also developing a really strong understanding or a deep understanding of what people's evolving transportation needs will be. There will be change. And I mean, you ask people a simple question at the moment, what do you need to support your commute? And you get a very complex and varied answer to that question. And for some, it's sort of more affordable options. It could be about increased service or, certainly the confidence that commuting won't make you sick. And, for others, it's about the very important first mile and last mile connections. And I think we need to take a moment now to really develop a meaningful response and engagement and understanding about what people need. I don't think we can really design a system that will be providing our community what they need unless we fully understand what they need. So I think, as I say, there's going to be this period of reflection, but I think more than ever now, public outreach during, say, the pre-design and concept design phase of the design is really more important than ever to really hone in on what's required.
I'm curious, are there systems or projects that are kind of moving forward that you think are early adapters on this or starting to think about this in the first wave?
And certainly agencies within, say, pedestrian analysis and pedestrian modelling, they're starting to develop these models that take into account the requirements for social distancing. So pedestrian analysis is certainly one part of it that's being adapted. We're finding that across a number of projects, actually, not just transportation, interestingly. The entrance that we designed at the corner of 33rd and 7th for Penn Station, New York City Transit's Enhanced Stations Initiative, that really got back to sort of the basics and the fundamentals of good station design and good transportation design that I think will weather this storm. They were sort of built on cornerstones of just light and air, increased circulation, removing congestion. And I think we need to get back to those really fundamental principles about just good station design and good facility design. That's going to give us longevity and adaptability, I think, as we move forward.
One of the other things we've noticed, of course, is with the opening of the streets and then opening restaurants onto the streets, New Yorkers, and not just New Yorkers, Americans are kind of looking at their streets in a new way. It's maybe kind of more of the European model.
Right.
And there was the announcement just last week that the city is going to extend that through the winter and essentially make it permanent. And I'd like to think that there are small communities all over America where people are suddenly saying, boy, it's kind of nice to be outside on the sidewalk. And
yeah, absolutely. I think this radical sort of drop in ridership that we talked about, whilst it's alarming in many instances, does present a wonderful opportunity for us to sort of reimagine public space and right-size a transportation system and even building stock that feeds that transportation system in a way that facilitates those opportunities. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think there is a great opportunity there for those sorts of changes to our street and open space.
Well, Amy, can I ask you, how do you think people are kind of perceiving what's going on? How are the users diagnosing this and thinking about using the system?
I feel like there's a few different ways that people are thinking about this. On the one hand, you have people who are very much on board with getting back on mass transit and are aware, as we've been told over and over, it's safe. You haven't seen any clusters that have popped up based on transit ridership. This hasn't happened in the US. It hasn't happened in other countries where COVID was a big issue. So transit is safe to ride. We know this, but there are still people who hesitate to get on it. And I think the MTA has done a good job. And I saw somebody tweet this the other day. The MTA has actually done a really great job of, telling people to wear masks and having its own public health campaigns, but we just need this wider nationwide public health awareness that if you live in a city like New York or DC or wherever there is a mass transit system, it's okay to get back on it. You don't have to rely on a car or whatever else to get into your respective places that you're going. But I think the other piece of that, and this isn't related to transit necessarily, is we don't know what's going to happen with people coming back to offices yet. I am a real estate editor. I look at data about what's going on in the office market all the time, and you still just don't even have companies that are super confident in having their employees back yet. So that's a big part of this. We just don't know who's going to come back to the office, when they're going to come back to the office. And that's driving so much of the mass transit usage on a regular basis anyway. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen without knowing when people are actually coming back to work. My office is in Midtown, but we don't have a plan yet for when we're going to be going in regularly. So it's all still really up in the air. But then you have the other piece of it, which is this quote unquote vroom boom, like people in New York buying cars, which I think Juliet's data about bridge and tunnel traffic being right back to normal kind of supports, at least anecdotally. I mean, I know people who've bought cars in the middle of the pandemic, and this is a very real thing. And I think people who want there to be more open streets and more, pedestrianization of the streets as a result of this, there's this back and forth over it's not good that we have so much car traffic back to normal. It's not good for a variety of reasons. We don't want the environmental impacts of it. We don't want the streets to be unsafe for people who are taking advantage of City Bike and these open streets programs. So there's just a lot of tension there too, I think, between this uptick in vehicular traffic and this very good, I will say from a personal opinion point of view, pedestrianization and more Europeanization, if you want to call it that, of our streets. So that's been really interesting too, because there's always that tension. But I think people who have been fighting for years to get more bike lanes and more pedestrian plazas and open streets are finally seeing this as an opening to get that done. And that's a really great thing. And I hope it can continue as we're getting into winter when it's going to start getting colder. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, we'll see how hardy we are as Americans. And I think your point about it's so hard to try and predict what the future is going to be like. Part of it is what's the timeline? How quickly will people come back? But the other part is, well, maybe some companies, some of these changes are going to be hardwired in. And of course, we look at, people come to me and say, well, Facebook has announced that people can work remotely through next year. And then you flip around and say, but they also just took a huge lease in the Farley post office building, over 700,000 square feet. So clearly they think somebody's going to move in. So kind of it's trying to distinguish between what's a kind of short-term trend and timing and what's a real fundamental change. Julia, what's the sense at the MTA or in the public sector? Are people starting to go back to the office?
I don't know beyond the MTA, but there's about, I'd say, 20% of non-essential workers coming into the office every day. I go 2 or 3 times a week. I love it. I have a pretty short commute, so it's easy. But the truth is, I really like seeing my colleagues. The human contact is so important to me. I think, it's easy to think that we can be just as productive on Zooms and by email and so on. But the conversations before and after the meetings are really important. They're sort of the fine fabric that makes the garment hang beautifully. So I encourage folks who can make it in to make it in. And the other thing that I'll say is that the first few times are weird. It's like we've been conditioned to be afraid, but you get used to it, maybe? You just sort of learn to feel it as a familiar experience again.
That was kind of my own experience. The first time I rode the subway, I thought this feels strange. And then I thought, well, but it's like the first time I went to a supermarket after a month of lockdown felt really strange too. And now I'm back to it. How about Luke, in the design world? What's the sense you have?
There's a number of our clients that are returning back to work, but there's a series of quite stringent protocols for them to return to work. From a sort of personal experience, SOM was actually midway through a renovation or actually to relocate to 7 World Trade Center just as COVID hit. So we are now in the process of kind of finishing that up. So we haven't had the first cohort officially return back to work yet. But I think talking with my colleagues, certainly there's a lot of them, and myself included, for all the reasons that Juliette just explained, are really looking forward to getting back to the office. And I think architecture, like, sort of many creative pursuits and engineering pursuits, is something that really feeds off of that human contact and being able to sit in a room and really work through a problem together. And I think Zoom, whilst it's been a good proxy for that for the last 6 months, there's no substitute for being in the office. And it's also amazing, you kind of just, those sort of social interactions that you have either just walking through the office or just pre or post a meeting, they're actually, I'm finding quite efficient ways to communicate information that don't require a half an hour Zoom to do the same thing. So whilst we're being extremely efficient, I think the length of our days is probably extended because those kind of water cooler conversations are not part of it anymore.
I'm curious if you guys have a sense. I'd love to know, just thinking about the changes that we're going through, are there some that you think are either very extremely temporary ones that are not going to be sticking with us, like the increased pedestrianization or biking or other things, or things that you think are likely to lock in and folks aren't going to change behavior, that in some ways COVID has accelerated certain things that were happening anyway, but are happening much more quickly because of this now? Amy, could I ask you first, are there any kind of, from a broader cultural sense, things that you're seeing that are either not going to switch back or something that people are all crazed about in 6 or 12 months we'll be over it?
This is going to sound paradoxical, but I think open restaurants will stick around. I don't think open streets will, because open streets enforcement has already been so scattershot. I live in Bed-Stuy, and there's supposed to be an open streets of about 3 blocks, about 4 blocks from my apartment. It is never open. I don't think the administration has really prioritized making sure that these open blocks, especially in not like high traffic or perhaps most tourist friendly areas, are really being enforced. And it's a shame because we should have more of this open space, especially in neighborhoods where you don't perhaps have as many parks or open spaces for people to move around. I'm not super confident in the de Blasio administration's commitment to that particular program. Mm-hmm. And I think, on the other hand, open restaurants will stick around because you have a very engaged and active lobbying group of restaurant owners and people who really need these to happen for their business's survival behind it. And it's proven really popular with people. Like I said, I live in Bed-Stuy. You can't walk around my neighborhood on a weekend or even on a weekday without seeing a ton of people outdoors at the different pop-ups that have come around my neighborhood. It's hard to say, like I said before, what's going to happen once the weather gets colder. Obviously, this is going to be a year-round thing and people will have heat lamps and maybe people will invest in snowsuits so they can eat outside. But I think it's gotten so popular that I can't see that going away after COVID, just because it's fun. And once you don't have the threat of getting sick hanging over your head, who wouldn't want to actually have this cool little pop-up from your favorite restaurant in your neighborhood outside that you can go to whenever you want? So yeah, I think the open programs, there's very different attitudes from the mayor's office towards them, it seems like, which I think is determining the success of one and the failure of the other.
That's interesting. Juliet, I'm curious at the MTA, are some of the changes baked in and things you're going to have to deal with, or some of it is we're trying to ride this out?
So I happen to work in the capital construction division. That's really what I'm most familiar with. And for us, the budgetary effect of COVID has been absolutely devastating. The way we look at everything is totally different. We happened to last year pass the very biggest capital construction program the MTA had ever had by a long shot. It was a 70% increase from the previous 5-year capital plan. And it was a testament to just really great leadership at the MTA, a very strong backing from the governor, and early successes that gave everybody the confidence to pass congestion pricing, the confidence to give us the additional monies and powers to transform the way our organization is run so that we're able to deliver projects, as my boss likes to say, better, faster, cheaper than ever before. So that was $55 billion. And now who knows what our capital program is going to end up being. You know, we received $4 billion in capital aid in the spring, but we're still facing a $12 billion shortfall through the end of 2021. That's on the operating budget, but the two budgets are somehow linked in complicated ways. And so we first have to make right the operating budget, and then that will have impact on capital. But for the most part, you know, we're not giving up on the big program because we really are hoping and frankly expecting the federal government to step in. But for now, we're just really focusing on the projects that absolutely need to get done to keep the system in good working order, what we call in state of good repair. But the sort of tragic thing is that putting off those investments actually has a really long-term impact, not just because we won't be seeing 2nd Avenue Subway Phase 2 or Penn Station Access or some of the big capital expansion projects for another few years, but even the sort of maintenance type work requires workforce and requires track outages that we can only provide at a particular rate. And so these short-term decisions, inability to give the system the frequent repairs that it needs, will take us longer to catch up on those in the next few years. So we're really hoping that the federal government comes through as they should.
Bring some money in. Well, can I ask, one of the most controversial pieces of this, of course, was the cessation of 24/7 subway service. And as you know, Juliet, since you worked on this too, at RPA, we had actually recommended a couple of years ago that the MTA consider, when trying to make a major capital improvement, add signals, upgraded signals, or other things, that they consider closing parts of the subway overnight, either for maintenance or capital upgrades. It was by far the most unpopular recommendation I have ever made in my career, and the pushback was enormous. But our thinking was, you know, running a 24/7 subway is really taxing on the system, and maybe we estimated kind of 1.5% of the daily riders were actually using the system in a couple of hours in the middle of the night, that the other 98.5% could benefit if you were to make those changes. So you guys were kind of forced to do that out of this crisis. People are talking about whether or not you're going to restore service. What is the thinking? What is going into those calculations? Is there going to be any movement in one direction or the other anytime soon?
I mean, those conversations are so politically fraught, but there are some, you know, rational reasons behind some of these decisions. So we are able to do more work at night. We have been able to accelerate a lot of the capital construction work that we had been slated to do this year and next year, and have been accelerating it in this period of low ridership and nightly closures. So we are able to do more work in the evening than we have before. I don't know how much money we're saving from not running service in the evening or overnights, I should say. I know that we continue to run trains on the tracks, in part for the work and in part just because we have to move the vehicles around. But time will tell. The primary reason was to keep the system clean, and we've been very successful at that. I haven't heard any plans to change.
I don't know that it's necessarily about the money you're saving by not running trains. I think it's more about the opportunity that it provides the construction projects for a longer window and a more consistent window for construction. It's interesting to hear what you say about the reduced funds, because clearly that is an issue. But it's almost a double-edged sword too, because if you don't make the systems more reliable, if you don't make them look clean and in fact be clean, the risk is that people aren't going to return to mass transit, that they're going to stay in their personal vehicles. So it's certainly an unfortunate state of affairs where the money just isn't there, but it's almost, you can't afford not to invest at this point in time, I think, which is the other side. So like you say, the funding from government is just such a critical piece of this puzzle. It's absolutely required.
I also do wonder if part of the reason why people are still hesitant about coming back to the subway is because we don't have overnight service back yet. If there's this sort of lack of confidence because you're still hearing, well, we need overnight service to not happen so we can clean the trains. And that might make people think, oh, well, they're taking all this time to clean them. What's going on during the day? Also, I know I was one of the people when the RPA made that recommendation who thought it was a really bad idea.
Thank you for saying that.
I mean, I think especially now how important it is to get essential workers who are often riding at off hours, who may be coming and going from hospital shifts or from working for the MTA at these weird times. Obviously, I think it had to happen at first, and I hope it comes back soon. And it's a shame that there's just so many hurdles to getting things back to where they were before all of this happened. And we probably won't ever go back to that, but
the New York City subway system is such a great democratizer, really, in terms of a one price ride, and the fact that it is 24/7 makes it accessible to everybody.
Yeah, and I think New Yorkers tend not to realize just how unique the system is in terms of that price, in terms of its reach and scope, and obviously the 24/7. I can kind of remember, I think I was in high school the first time being in Paris and discovering that the subway system was shutting down. And I was like, what? What kind of rinky-dink system are we talking about here? Who's ever heard of a subway shutting down? And it turns out that's actually more typical in the rest of the
I lived in London for 5 years, and there was always a mad rush at 12 o'clock to catch the last train home.
Part of the idea, and I think, Luke, to what you're saying, is we need to see the system come back and come back better than before. I mean, a major piece of this that we've all looked at and talked about is kind of upgrading the signal system, because New York subway still runs on an antiquated signal system, and it's been slowly, there are 2 lines today that have modern signals. And that's about running trains safely, more closely together, and really adding more capacity on parts of the system. So it's kind of like it's trying to catch up with the rest of the world on things like that we have been really behind on. And again, the $50+ billion capital plan was going to give us the opportunity to do that. That funding is very much at risk, and we're trying to just kind of support the reopening of the economy. Trying to look past the cycle of pandemic and recovery 5 or even 10 years out from now. What do you think will have changed because of this, because of what we're going through in 2020 that will still be with us? Or do you think 10 years from now we'll be roughly where we would have been anyway without too much of a change?
Personally, I would like to see certainly more of a continuation of this trend to bicycle lanes, and just for the short movements through the city, first mile, last mile, those sorts of things. I think that's a wonderful opportunity, not only to sort of decompress the stations as well, but it's actually a fantastic vibe to continue within the streets. And I think it's unfortunate to hear sort of what Amy was saying about the open streets in her area, but perhaps there is an opportunity here to focus bike highways through key sort of thoroughfares within the city and really amplify those going forward. There's so many health benefits, mobility benefits, and so forth to increase bicycle usage, and you can look to Europe for many of those. So I would hope that that's a trend that continues.
Yeah, I have to add there, Luke, that earlier this summer, RPA released what we called our 5-borough bikeway plan, which is to essentially kind of fill out and connect the whole network. We do have portions that are terrific, but too much of it is either disconnected. Every couple of blocks, you find yourself suddenly fighting traffic, or it's not really grade separated or something. And we're all kind of hoping in the advocacy community that the candidates for mayor are going to be fighting over each other to become stronger advocates for this vision too. And we're hopeful that that'll get there.
I think there really is a big opportunity for more bus lanes. The MTA can relatively quickly put more buses on the street to provide the service, and that would make a really big difference.
The 14th Street bus lane has been a fantastic example of that, and something that should be rolled out more. I would wholeheartedly agree.
To give them credit, the folks who work for the city on those and at the DOT and others say, each one of those bus lanes is enormously controversial. They're fighting over every single parking spot they're trying to take out. And we're kind of hoping that the narrative would change given this situation, but in some ways it still seems like you're fighting an uphill battle to get those put in place, which is surprising given how much we rely on the system and how much we've utilized it.
The longer we wait, the harder it's going to be. I think that right now, while people are,
Absolutely.
I do think that's a very vocal minority. And I say this as a member of the media who covers this stuff, but they get a lot of press. And that gives the politicians this impression that, oh, we really need to listen to these people who are fighting against this. The 14th Street busway, it was one lawyer who brought so many different challenges to it. And it was very unpopular in the wider scope of things because once the busway was implemented, everybody saw how great it was. I personally think that politicians need to, in these cases, maybe not defer so much to local input and just get things moving so that we can get people moving. You see they're successful, you see that they are improving how people get around, they're making it quicker to get around, and that's what we need right now. So it's hard to say. I think he has very good reasons for doing it, but I'm a little bummed that Corey Johnson dropped out of the mayor's race because he had a really good vision for streets and how you could put bike lanes and more bus lanes and all this other stuff together. So hopefully he'll continue to find a way to do that in other areas of government. But I think what Juliet and Luke said, I would love to see the streets more friendly to bikers, more bus lanes, less car traffic. When I was at Curb New York, we advocated for getting rid of cars in Manhattan entirely. I don't think that's a bad idea. I don't know if the trend is going to go that way with this supposed uptick in people buying cars, but I think both for the long-term ability for people to get around quickly and safely, we need to do it. And for the long-term health of the planet and the city, we can't continue to have cars dominating, and we need more efficient and eco-friendly ways of getting around being prioritized. And that's mass transit, that's bikes, that's micromobility methods that aren't on our streets yet, like scooters and things like that. So we just need to make it easier, and I hope that that's a trend that we can continue in the next decade.
Yeah, I'll add to that, Amy. Through the experience on the Surface Transportation Council, then I really give a shout out to Commissioner Polly Trottenberg and her staff on this. We asked for a kind of how has HOV been used in the past in the city, and after Superstorm Sandy and 9/11, these policies were put into place. And when the DOT shared the data from it, you could only draw one conclusion, which is these suckers really work. Every time the city has put in HOV restrictions, essentially the number of vehicles comes down dramatically, the number of people getting in stays the same, and traffic declines dramatically because everybody gets around much faster. And that's why one of the key recommendations of that group was for the city to be ready with HOV policies when and if it would be necessary, which I'll go out on a limb and say is going to be pretty soon, I think. But unfortunately, we haven't seen the politicians really pick that up yet. I think anybody who works on the issues understands this.
Yeah. And that actually made me think of another thing, which is congestion pricing, which we don't know what's going to happen with that at this point, but I really hope we can move it forward because I think it ties together a lot of the things we're talking about, like the MTA needs funding, congestion pricing. We need to reduce car traffic in the city, congestion pricing. This is a way to do all of this. And obviously COVID has changed so much and it might make it more politically unpopular than it was already, but I think that's something we really need to keep fighting for.
Yeah. Well, Juliet, you worked on that for a long time too. Can you give us any sense of what the feeling within the MTA is about the future of congestion pricing? It was supposed to be coming in January. Nobody's holding their breath for that.
So we're doing our part. We're building the infrastructure for it, and we keep pushing in Washington, D.C. for them to take action and decide the formal process that they're going to have to go through to pass congestion pricing and make it law. It would bring in $1 billion every year, which right now is sorely needed. So I don't quite understand what the hesitation is other than just sort of slow processes in DC. I wanted to circle back to a point that was made earlier about traffic and making sure that there's enough capacity to get people in and out. I mean, you asked earlier about things that might come back in a couple of years and things that are here for the long run. One of the big questions in my mind, and this isn't sort of MTA corporate thinking or anything, I'm just speaking for myself, but anecdotally, you look around at rush hour and the trains had been very, very packed. 40% of our operating income comes from fares. So our income structure is based on having a couple hours of very packed train cars. And I'm very optimistic about the future of the city, but I don't know how long it's going to be till we're back to those levels. So that's almost sort of a structural change that's going to happen in, those initial maps that you showed at the top of the hour, Tom. How are people going to get in? The transit numbers are just, I don't think are going to be that high for many years. Even if the economy is going to pick up again, folks are going to have to get in a different way. And so getting more bus lanes, getting more people per car is going to be really important.
Well, I mean, the flip side of it from the way I try to think about it is that to some degree, kind of flattening the demand curve, if we can spread out the usage of the system over the day, that's very good and efficient. I mean, one way of looking at the transit system, and this is, from RPA's perspective, we've been talking about building Second Avenue subway and a new tunnel under the Hudson River and all these other big things. And I think a lot of them are still necessary, but it's about adding capacity. Whereas, maybe if we can spread the demand out, we can better utilize it. I don't know, Luke, if you had
I was going to say the same thing, Tom. I think finding a symbiotic relationship between, the building stock, the way you use those buildings, so your office hours, flexible work hours, combined with the work from home, and then right sizing this entire network to accommodate that need, I think is critical. It may be, Julia, that you don't actually come back to the same peaks, but the same number of people are coming into the city and using the buildings. It's in shifts, or it's sort of more dynamic in the way that they do that. I also think that in answer to the congestion pricing and congestion charging, and trying to limit the number of cars in the city, I think it's also about increasing the choice and your ability to get into Manhattan by other means. So is the answer there, something like the East River Skyway, for example, where that was a gondola that's compared to sort of $1 billion a mile or whatever the statistic is for a subway is a much cheaper proposition. So maybe we need to look to sort of more broader forms of transportation that perhaps were once dismissed as an answer to getting people into and around the city. That could be a wonderful way to arrive in Manhattan via a gondola every day rather than a paid train pass. So maybe there's answers in some of those once dismissed modes as well.
I'm also part of the group, the Friends of the BQX, which is still trying to get a light rail built along with Brooklyn.
I'd put that absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And as far as I can tell, really the main opposition to that is just getting rid of the on-street parking, because people consider their parking sacrosanct. It drives me crazy.
I just hope that both on a city level, like on every level, I think we need people who have vision to really consider the future of transportation. And I think the de Blasio administration has done some good things. I think COVID has not helped, and it obviously is making things a lot more difficult to implement. But I don't think we've seen quite enough push behind some of the stuff we're talking about here, like better expansion of open streets and better enforcement of that, and ensuring that busways can be put in and having the DOT kind of figure out where they would go and how to prioritize that. I think what I really would like to see happen in the future is having the political will behind these kinds of projects. And we're coming into an election cycle where we're not just going to have a new mayor, we're going to have almost an entirely new city council next year. We're going to have new borough presidents. We're going to have a lot of different faces in New York City politics. And I hope that the people who are coming in will take this year that we've spent looking at all of our ways of getting around, getting upended, and think about how they can really revolutionize the way New Yorkers get around. There's only so much the MTA can do if it's not going to have the money that it needs to get things done. So we're going to have to really think about this from a lot of different perspectives. And if that means, we don't have so much parking, okay, maybe that's not a bad thing. If it means that we have way more bike lanes, that's a good thing. So I think that's my takeaway, is just we need a lot of visionary thinking to get the city where it needs to go in the future.
Yeah. Actually, to your point, I'm thinking 8 years ago, I couldn't have told you what the major candidates' positions on all this stuff was. It wasn't like that was one of those issues that you would have a kind of checkbox on or anything like that. And maybe it's up to all of us this year to make sure that we suss them out, we make them tell us just exactly what they think about these things. And to your point earlier, Corey Johnson has been quite vocal and out there on this stuff. And so at least we knew where he stood, which was nice.
Yeah. And hopefully somebody else will pick up the mantle. I mean, we don't even really know who the front runners are at this point for mayor, but I mean, it's clearly something people want. And there are a lot of great groups doing a lot of advocacy around this, not just RPA, but Transportation Alternatives and the Riders Alliance. So
yeah, the transit advocacy community and others are really good. Luke, can I ask, what would you like to see? What's your kind of hope for the future of transportation?
Well, so I think beyond science, I guess, in the race to find a vaccine, and transportation is probably the fundamental part of getting our cities moving again. I think we know that habits and preferences of things like teleworking and commuting and so forth are going to change. and as people start to ease back into their new norm. So I think our transportation systems need to adapt. I think that business as usual and systems of the past are something that certainly needs to adapt. There's certainly an immediate need to restore confidence in mass transit, I think, to get our cities up and running. But I do think beyond the short term, we have a really unique opportunity to revision the transportation systems that are going to provide a more connected and flexible, sustainable, and certainly a healthier future. So I think when the dust settles on all of this, I think there is a very fantastic opportunity, and I think we have a brighter future. So I think as designers and policymakers, I think we have an opportunity here to lead and really envision what we want to see for our system.
Yeah, I'll say as you're talking, I am thinking through, talking about the system adapting, of course, these are, billions and billions of dollars invested in a system that works a certain way. So it's not like it can turn on a dime. So figuring out how it's going to adapt, I think is still going to be a real challenge. I don't know if you have any specific thoughts about that.
I would say, getting back to basics of just good station design, I think is critical. Increase the various modes, but I think we have a very good system in terms of diversity of modes. I think where we're perhaps lacking in some instances is the interconnected nature of each of those modes. So like the subway talking to the rider that's going to get on a Metro North train, so that you can optimize this perhaps through the use of technology and apps and so forth to create sort of a just-in-time interchange between modes. I think we have, like I say, a subway system that covers more areas than anyone that I'm certainly familiar with. But it is lacking in those sort of connections between the various modes. So I would like to see more focus on those sorts of things. And I think the more optimized those interconnections are, or those interchanges are, the less waiting you have in these facilities, which is, less crowding, a healthier environment and so forth. So I think the focus also needs to be on those interchanges.
That's an excellent point in figuring out how technology can kind of smooth the gaps and the linkages between them. I'll also say to your comment earlier about confidence, it is I'll just say it. Why isn't the mayor every single day getting on a subway or a bus with some other people, inviting the camera crews along and showing that it's the safe thing to do? Like lead by example. That would really be something nice to try and send that messaging. Juliet, I'll give you the last word. What are your hopes for the future?
I think Amy and Luke just said it so eloquently. I don't have that much to add other than sort of at its core, America is culturally has been a very rural and suburban oriented country, right? It's sort of our roots, and it's really only been the last 20, 30 years that New York has practiced urbanism and fine-tuned it with every year that goes by. We just get better and better at it. And I would hope that the lessons that we've learned in the last 10, 15 years will build on themselves. And as folks reinvest in the city, either as individuals and families or as businesses, that they would recommit to the city as an urban experience. And as Luke said, sort of adapt and draw on that creativity to recreate the city that we want.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to talk about it. And I agree with you. I grew up in a suburban nation and a suburbanizing nation, even in the tri-state metropolitan region. But really kind of over the last 20 years, something changed. And there was also, when COVID struck, there was a kind of assumption that density and urbanity was a bad thing and would be against us. And now we've discovered over the summer, and especially in the fall, is that, what really drives the pandemic are kids getting together and drinking beer and other things, which happens just as much in rural Pennsylvania as it does in lower Manhattan or Brooklyn or Queens. It's not about the overall density. It's about overcrowding. It's about behavior that isn't safe that can occur just as much in a suburban or rural part of the country as an urban part of the country. And somehow early on, we were conflating those things and assuming that it was all much more dangerous.
People confuse density and proximity, and it's not density. If you're close to one another, sure. And in New York, we are on each other all the time. There's no getting around that, but it's not a density issue. It's just proximity.
Yeah. And I'll say the first time I rode the subway just a few weeks ago, to look around and see every single person in the train with their masks on, over their noses, practicing the right behavior. And I thought, I feel okay here. I'm happy to be here. I'm glad to do this. Thanks, you guys. It's been really fun talking to you all. I appreciate your perspectives and input on this. And I hope we all go out and now start to see the system recover and become what we need, because Lord knows we need it. So thanks a lot. And thanks so much, Design Talks Now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, Luke, Amy, and Juliet, for sharing your insight and behind-the-scenes experience. Your work is essential to keeping our infrastructure going, and thanks for helping us make our personal decisions on which modes of transportation are most comfortable for each of us at this time. Although the long-term answers are not yet clear, we examine these needs with longevity and adaptability in mind. And New Yorkers have a say through their vote for mayor to help create the city that we want. Who will increase confidence in getting our city back and running? Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and please check out our head-high book kiosk reading selection to complement and enhance the Design Talk series, matching each talk, including this one. Find it on the Design Pavilion website at design-pavilion.com. And please continue to stay safe, stay smart. Design stands together.